June 27, 1944, Villers-Bocage, Normandy. Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann sat in the commander's position of his Tiger tank and studied the British Sherman tanks advancing down the road. The German ace had already destroyed over 100 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front. He understood armor better than almost anyone in the Wehrmacht, and he was not impressed by what he was seeing. The Shermans were moving in a column with their vulnerable sides exposed. Their thin armor could barely resist German anti-tank guns. Their short 75mm guns couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any reasonable range. To Wittmann, these were targets, not threats. What Wittmann didn't notice was one tank near the end of the column that looked slightly different. The turret was longer. The gun barrel extended further forward. The silhouette was subtly wrong for a standard Sherman. This was a Sherman Firefly. It mounted a 17-pounder anti-tank gun that could punch through the frontal armor of any German tank at ranges exceeding a mile. The British had taken their most common tank and turned it into a tank killer that German crews had never encountered. Wittmann was about to discover that not all Shermans were equal. Some could kill Tigers. The development of the Sherman Firefly represented Britain's response to an urgent tactical problem. British tank guns in 1942 and early 1943 were inadequate against German heavy armor. The 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns that armed most British tanks couldn't reliably penetrate Tiger and Panther tanks at combat ranges. British tank crews were getting killed because they couldn't destroy German tanks that could easily destroy them. Britain needed a better gun. They needed it quickly. And they needed it in quantities that would make a difference on the battlefield. The solution was improvisation rather than new design. Take an existing excellent anti-tank gun and install it in an existing reliable tank. The result was a weapon that would fundamentally change tank combat in Northwest Europe. German intelligence had dismissed British tank development as inferior throughout the war. Reports from the North African campaign consistently described British tanks as mechanically unreliable and undergunned. German tank commanders who had fought British armored units in the desert remembered easy victories against Crusader and Cromwell tanks. These early British designs were indeed inferior to German Panzer, Mark IVs, and Tigers. German assessments concluded that British tank doctrine was flawed and British industrial design was inadequate. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong when applied to the Sherman Firefly. The British had learned from their early failures and developed responses that German intelligence completely failed to anticipate. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun had been developed in 1942 as a response to a increasingly heavy German armor. British weapons designers recognized that the 6-pounder gun would not be adequate for future battles. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front described new German tanks with armor that was twice as thick as anything seen in North Africa. The Tiger tank mounted an 88mm gun and had frontal armor more than 4 inches thick. No existing British tank gun could reliably penetrate such protection. They needed something more powerful. The 17-pounder fired a shell that weighed 17 pounds. The shell left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy was enormous. The armor penetration was better than anything the British had fielded before. When fired at a Tiger tank at 1,000 yards, the 17-pounder could penetrate the frontal armor. No previous British tank gun could make that claim. The weapon was effective and deadly, but it was heavy and bulky. Installing it in a tank turret posed serious engineering challenges. Multiple tank designs were considered as platforms for the 17-pounder. The Cromwell tank was examined but rejected because the turret ring was too small. The Churchill tank could potentially mount the gun but was too slow for mobile operations. The ideal solution would have been a purpose-built tank designed around the gun. But developing and building such a tank would take years. Britain didn't have years. The invasion of Europe was scheduled for June 1944. British tank units needed better firepower before then. The only realistic option was to adapt an existing tank to carry the gun. The Sherman was chosen because it was available in large numbers through Lend-Lease from America. The turret ring was large enough to potentially accommodate the bigger gun. The chassis was reliable and well understood. The question was whether British engineers could actually make it work. The engineering challenges were substantial. The 17-pounder gun was much longer than the Sherman's standard 75-millimeter gun. The barrel extended nearly 5 feet further forward. This changed the tank's center of gravity and made it nose-heavy. The recoil was more powerful. The standard Sherman recoil mechanism wasn't designed to handle the forces generated by the 17-pounder. The ammunition was larger and heavier. Standard Sherman ammunition racks couldn't hold 17-pounder shells. The turret would need to be modified extensively. The gun mounting would need to be redesigned. The recoil system would need to be adapted. The interior layout would need to be reconfigured. Every aspect of the installation required careful engineering to ensure the tank would actually function in combat. The team assigned to solve these problems worked around the clock. They had months to accomplish what would normally take years. Failure meant British tank crews would go into Normandy with guns that couldn't kill German heavy tanks. The pressure was immense. The first prototype Sherman Firefly was completed in January 1944. Testing revealed numerous problems that hadn't been anticipated during the design phase. The gun recoil was so violent that it damaged the turret mounting after just a few shots. The long barrel made the tank extremely nose-heavy. When the gun was pointed forward, the front of the tank was much heavier than the rear. This affected mobility and made the tank harder to drive. The gunner's position was cramped because the larger gun breech took up more space inside the turret. The radio had to be relocated because the original position was now occupied by the gun mechanism. The ammunition racks needed complete redesigning to accommodate the larger shells. Every test revealed new issues that had to be solved before the tank could be considered combat ready. The engineers worked methodically through each problem. They strengthened the turret ring with additional steel reinforcement. They redesigned the recoil mechanism to better absorb the forces generated by the 17-pounder. They added counterweights to the rear of the tank to balance the weight of the longer gun. They modified the interior layout to give the gunner adequate space to operate. They relocated electrical systems and radio equipment to make room for larger ammunition storage. They tested each modification rigorously to ensure it worked under combat conditions. By March 1944, they had a working combat-ready tank that incorporated solutions to all the major problems. Production began immediately. The British converted existing Sherman tanks rather than building new tanks from scratch. This approach was faster and made better use of available resources. Sherman tanks arriving from American factories under Lend-Lease were diverted to British conversion facilities. British workers stripped out the standard turret equipment. They installed the 17-pounder gun with its modified mounting system. They fitted new radio equipment designed to work with the revised interior layout. They installed additional armor protection in critical areas. They painted new identification markings to help friendly forces recognize the converted tanks. Each conversion required hundreds of hours of skilled work by experienced technicians. But by D-Day on June 6, 1944, British armored units had received several hundred Firefly tanks. It wasn't as many as commanders wanted, but it was enough to make a difference in the battles ahead. The doctrine for using Firefly tanks was developed quickly as crews trained for the invasion. The Firefly would not operate alone. It would be part of a standard Sherman troop, which consisted of 4 tanks. 3 of those tanks would be standard Shermans with 75-millimeter guns. 1 would be a Firefly with the 17-pounder. The standard Shermans would engage most targets, including infantry, soft vehicles, and German medium tanks. The Firefly would be held back specifically to engage German heavy tanks that the 75-millimeter guns couldn't reliably destroy. This preserved the Firefly for the targets that only it could handle. German tank commanders learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the Firefly. They quickly realized that the long-barreled Sherman was far more dangerous than standard models. Fireflies became priority targets, but identifying them at range was difficult. And closing to engagement range with a Firefly was extremely dangerous. The training of Firefly crews was intensive and specialized. Gunners had to learn to operate a gun that was significantly different from the standard Sherman armament. The 17-pounder had different ballistics, different ammunition, different loading procedures. The gun was heavier and more difficult to traverse manually. The sights were different. The firing procedures were more complex. Loaders had to learn to handle much heavier shells. The 17-pounder ammunition weighed twice as much as 75-millimeter shells. Loading the gun quickly while the tank was moving required strength and skill. Commanders had to learn new tactics for employing the Firefly effectively. They had to understand when to engage and when to hold fire. They had to coordinate with other tanks in the troop to maximize the Firefly's effectiveness. The training was demanding, but essential. A poorly trained Firefly crew was just as vulnerable as any other tank crew. The gun was only effective when used by crews who understood its capabilities and limitations. The Germans had developed their own heavy tanks in response to Soviet heavy armor on the Eastern Front. The Tiger tank weighed 54 tons and mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at long range. The frontal armor was so thick that most Allied anti-tank weapons were ineffective against it. Crews operating Tigers had become accustomed to engaging enemy tanks without fear of being destroyed in return. The Panther tank was lighter and faster, but still mounted a powerful 75mm gun and had sloped armor that was difficult to penetrate. These tanks had been devastatingly effective on the Eastern Front against Soviet T-34 tanks. German tank crews believed they would be equally effective against the British and Americans in France. They assumed Allied tanks would be easy prey, just as Soviet tanks had been. The arrival of the Firefly would shatter those assumptions. German intelligence reports from early 1944 noted that some British tanks appeared to have longer guns than standard Shermans. Reconnaissance photographs showed Shermans with extended barrels, but the significance wasn't fully appreciated. Intelligence analysts assumed these were minor modifications. Perhaps the British were experimenting with higher velocity versions of the 75mm gun. Perhaps they were testing new muzzle brakes or barrel extensions. The possibility that the British had mounted a completely different and much more powerful gun wasn't seriously considered. German tank crews were briefed that all Shermans had weak armor and inadequate guns. The tactical doctrine was to engage at range where German guns could penetrate Allied armor, but Allied guns couldn't penetrate German armor. This doctrine had worked well for years. German tank commanders had no reason to doubt it would continue working. They were confident in their technical superiority. That confidence was about to prove fatal. The first major combat test of the Sherman Firefly came during the fighting around Caen in the weeks after D-Day. British armored units were attempting to break through German defensive positions that were heavily reinforced with Tiger and Panther tanks. The standard Sherman tanks were suffering heavy casualties. German tanks would engage at long range, where their superior guns and armor gave them overwhelming advantage. British tank crews were being killed in one-sided battles, where they couldn't effectively fight back. The Fireflies changed this equation dramatically. For the first time since encountering German heavy tanks, British crews had a weapon that could fight back effectively at long range. The results were stunning. Lieutenant John Gorman commanded a Firefly in the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry. His tank was part of a troop that included 3 standard Shermans with 75mm guns. On June 22nd, his troop encountered 3 Panther tanks positioned on a ridgeline overlooking the British advance. The Panthers were hull down behind the crest of the ridge with only their turrets visible. This was a standard German defensive tactic that made the tanks very difficult targets while allowing them to engage British tanks advancing across open ground. The standard doctrine would have called for British tanks to try to maneuver to flank positions where they might penetrate the thinner side armor of the Panthers. This maneuver would have taken time and exposed the British tanks to German fire during the approach. Many British tanks would have been destroyed during the flanking movement. Gorman had a better option. He ordered his driver to halt at a range of 1,400 yards and his gunner to engage the lead Panther. This was beyond the effective range of the Panther's gun against the Sherman's frontal armor, but it was well within the effective range of the 17-pounder. The gun roared. The shell left the barrel with a muzzle velocity that was nearly double that of the standard Sherman gun. The shell struck the Panther's frontal armor and punched through like the armor was cardboard. The penetration was clean and devastating. The German tank exploded as ammunition inside detonated. The crew had no chance to escape. The 2nd Panther immediately fired at Gorman's Firefly, but the shot went high. German gunners weren't used to engaging targets at such long range and miscalculated the trajectory. Gorman's gunner fired again. Another perfect hit. Another Panther destroyed. The 3rd Panther reversed behind the ridgeline and escaped before it could be engaged. In less than 2 minutes, Gorman's crew had destroyed 2 Panthers at a range where they had assumed they were safe. German tank doctrine was based on the assumption that British tanks couldn't hurt them at long range. That assumption was no longer valid. The destruction of those Panthers was witnessed by other British tank crews in the area. Word spread quickly through radio communications. The Firefly could kill Panthers frontally at long range. This was exactly the capability British tank units had been waiting for. Morale skyrocketed. Tank commanders who had been approaching German heavy tanks with dread suddenly felt confident. They had a weapon that could fight back. The 17-pounder gave British tank crews the psychological edge they had been lacking since first encountering German heavy armor in Tunisia. The news also spread to German units in the area. Tank commanders radioed warnings about long-barreled Shermans that could penetrate frontal armor at extended range. German tactics immediately began to change. Tank commanders became more cautious about exposing themselves at long range. They used more terrain to mask their positions. They tried to close to shorter ranges where their own guns would be more effective. But these tactical adjustments actually played to British strengths. British tank crews were better trained in close-quarters combat. British tanks were more reliable and available in greater numbers. When German tanks gave up their range advantage to close for short-range engagements, they found themselves fighting on terms that favored the British. The destruction of those Panthers near Caen was repeated across the battlefield as more Fireflies engaged German armor. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to dominating engagements suddenly found themselves vulnerable. The long-range immunity they had relied on was gone. Any Sherman might be a Firefly, and any Firefly could kill even the heaviest German tank if the crew was skilled and the conditions were right. The psychological impact was profound. German tank crews who had felt invincible now felt hunted. They couldn't distinguish Fireflies from standard Shermans at long range. This meant they had to treat every Sherman as potentially deadly. The tactical advantage shifted dramatically in favor of the British. Michael Wittmann learned about Fireflies the hard way. On August 8, 1944, Wittmann's Tiger tank was advancing near the village of Sintho as part of a German counterattack. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen. German armored units were trying to stop them. Wittmann had destroyed over 130 Allied tanks in his career. He was one of Germany's most decorated tank aces. He had survived countless engagements on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He was confident and aggressive. His reputation preceded him. Allied tank crews knew his name and feared his tactical skill. Wittmann saw several Sherman tanks positioned in a defensive line ahead of his advance. His tactical assessment was routine. The Tigers would engage at long range where their superior guns and armor would dominate. The Shermans would be destroyed before they could effectively return fire. Then the German infantry would follow through the breach in the Allied line. It was a proven tactic that had worked countless times before. Wittmann had no reason to believe this engagement would be any different. He ordered his driver to advance to engagement range. He ordered his gunner to prepare to fire. The routine was familiar and comfortable. What Wittmann didn't realize was that several of the Shermans in that defensive line were Fireflies from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment. The gunners in those tanks had been trained specifically to engage German heavy tanks. They had practiced the shot until they could do it reliably under pressure. They had memorized the weak points in Tiger armor. They knew exactly where to aim to achieve penetration. They understood the ballistics of their gun and could compensate for range and wind. They were waiting for targets exactly like Wittmann's Tiger. When Wittmann's tank came into range, multiple Fireflies opened fire almost simultaneously. The 17-pounder shell struck the Tiger from multiple angles. At least one shell penetrated the armor and exploded inside the fighting compartment. The Tiger exploded violently as ammunition and fuel ignited. Michael Wittmann and his entire crew were killed instantly. Germany's greatest tank ace had been destroyed by the weapon German tankers had underestimated. The invincible Tiger had proven to be very mortal when faced with the Firefly's 17-pounder gun. The legend of Wittmann ended in a few seconds of concentrated firepower from weapons the Germans had dismissed as inadequate. The death of Wittmann was a shock to German armored forces. If their most skilled commander could be killed by British tanks, what did that mean for average crews? German tank doctrine emphasized the superiority of German equipment and training. The destruction of a Tiger by Sherman tanks contradicted everything German crews had been taught. Reports of the engagement were initially dismissed as inaccurate. German commanders refused to believe that Shermans could destroy Tigers frontally, but similar reports kept coming in. More Tigers were being destroyed. More Panthers were being knocked out at long range. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Something had changed in the tank battle. The Germans quickly recognized that Fireflies were priority targets that had to be destroyed before they could engage. German heavy tanks. German doctrine was modified to emphasize identifying and destroying Fireflies first. Tank commanders were issued recognition guides showing the differences between standard Shermans and Fireflies. The longer gun barrel was the most obvious distinguishing feature. The different turret shape was more subtle but still recognizable to trained observers. German crews were ordered to look for these differences and engage Fireflies as priority targets. Snipers were given specific orders to target Firefly commanders. German infantry were trained to identify Fireflies and call in artillery strikes on their positions. German anti-tank guns were positioned to cover approaches that Fireflies would likely use. Every effort was made to neutralize the Firefly threat before it could be employed against German heavy tanks. But all of these countermeasures required German forces to identify Fireflies correctly. This was not always possible in the confusion and limited visibility of combat. Many Fireflies were able to engage German tanks before being identified as the primary threat. British crews learned to disguise their Fireflies to make identification more difficult. They welded false muzzle brakes onto the barrels to change the silhouette. The false muzzle brake made the gun appear shorter than it actually was. They painted camouflage patterns that broke up the distinctive shape of the longer turret. They attached foliage and camouflage netting to obscure the tank's outline. They positioned the tanks behind standard Shermans to hide the longer gun until the moment of engagement. They avoided firing until German tanks were committed to engagement and couldn't easily withdraw. These tactical adaptations made the Firefly even more deadly. German tank commanders could never be certain where the real threat was positioned. Every engagement became a deadly gamble. Any Sherman might kill you before you could determine if it was a Firefly or not. The technical performance of the 17-pounder gun exceeded expectations in combat conditions. The armor penetration was reliable against all German tank types at normal combat ranges. A Tiger tank could be penetrated frontally at ranges up to 1,500 yards in ideal conditions. A Panther could be penetrated at similar ranges. Even the heavily armored Jagd Panzer tank destroyers were vulnerable to the 17-pounder at typical engagement distances. The accuracy was excellent. Experienced gunners could hit targets consistently at ranges exceeding a mile in good visibility conditions. The gun was inherently accurate due to its high muzzle velocity and well-designed ammunition. Shells flew in relatively flat trajectories that simplified range estimation and reduced the effect of minor aiming errors. The reliability was adequate despite the heavy recoil and complex mounting system. Early concerns about mechanical failures proved largely unfounded. The gun mechanism was robust and could withstand the stresses of combat operations. Breakdowns were less frequent than initially feared. Most mechanical problems could be repaired by crew members using standard tools and spare parts. The ammunition supply was maintained despite the larger shells requiring more logistic support. Each 17-pounder shell was nearly twice the weight of a 75mm shell. This meant ammunition trucks carried fewer rounds per load, but British logistics personnel adapted quickly. Additional ammunition vehicles were assigned to Firefly-equipped units. Supply lines were adjusted to account for the higher consumption rates. Shell production was increased to meet demand. British industrial production ramped up to meet the demand for Firefly conversions and 17-pounder ammunition. Factories worked around the clock to convert Sherman tanks and produce shells. The conversion process was streamlined as workers gained experience. Production time per tank was reduced from weeks to days. Quality control ensured that converted tanks met combat standards. By the late summer of 1944, Fireflies were being produced at a rate that allowed most British tank troops to include at least one in their standard formation. The industrial effort was massive, but it was sustained throughout the remainder of the war. German tank crews developed a grudging respect for the Firefly that bordered on fear. Interrogation reports from captured German tankers consistently mentioned the long-barreled Sherman as the most dangerous Allied tank they had faced. The 17-pounder gun was recognized as a serious threat to all German armor. One Panther commander captured in August 1944 told his interrogators that he had destroyed 5 standard Shermans in one engagement near Falaise. The battle had been proceeding normally. His crew was confident and effective. Then a Firefly he hadn't noticed fired from concealment and destroyed his tank with a single shot. He said the only warning was the sound of the shell hitting his tank. There was no time to react, no time to take evasive action. His crew escaped through the commander's hatch, but 2 men were wounded by spalling metal inside the tank. He said he had never felt as vulnerable in a Panther as he did after encountering Fireflies. The invincibility of German heavy armor had been revealed as an illusion. Another captured German described an engagement where his Tiger tank faced multiple Shermans at long range. He assumed he could destroy them one by one while remaining immune to their return fire. He destroyed 2 standard Shermans quickly. Then a 3rd Sherman fired back. The shell struck his Tiger's frontal armor and penetrated completely. The tank didn't explode but was disabled. His driver was killed and his gunner was severely wounded. Only then did he realize he had been engaged by a Firefly. He said he had never imagined that a Sherman could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. The experience completely changed his understanding of tank combat. After that engagement, he treated every Sherman as potentially deadly, regardless of its apparent type. The production numbers tell the story of the Firefly's success and its impact on the broader tank war. By the end of 1944, approximately 2,000 Sherman Fireflies had been produced and deployed to British and Canadian armored units. This represented roughly 15 to 20% of all Shermans in British service. That proportion was carefully calculated based on tactical analysis and combat experience. Too few Fireflies in British units would lack the firepower to engage German heavy tanks effectively. Too many, and the logistics of supplying the larger ammunition would become unmanageable. The ratio of 1 Firefly per troop of 4 tanks proved to be optimal. It gave every British tank unit the capability to engage German heavy armor while maintaining the flexibility and reliability of the standard Sherman for other missions. The Germans could not match this combination of numbers and capability. They were being outproduced and outgunned simultaneously. The tactical impact of the Firefly was amplified by the declining quality of German tank crews as the war progressed. The experienced crews who had fought brilliantly on the Eastern Front were being killed or wounded faster than they could be replaced. Training programs for new crews had been shortened due to fuel shortages and time pressures. New German tank crews in late 1944 had significantly less training and experience than the veterans who had dominated tank battles earlier in the war. They made mistakes that experienced crews would have avoided. A veteran German crew might have identified a Firefly at long range and taken appropriate tactical action. A green crew often didn't realize they were facing a Firefly until it fired at them. By then, it was usually too late to escape. The combination of better British equipment and declining German crew quality shifted the tactical balance decisively. By late 1944, British tank crews were achieving kill ratios against German armor that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The German response to the Firefly threat included several technical and tactical adaptations. German ammunition designers developed new armor-piercing shells with tungsten cores that could penetrate Allied tank armor more effectively. These Panzer Granite 40 shells had excellent penetration characteristics, but required tungsten, which Germany increasingly lacked. The special ammunition was never available in adequate quantities. Most German tank crews continued using standard ammunition throughout the war. New tank destroyers like the Jagd Panther were developed with powerful guns that could outrange and outgun the Firefly. The Jagd Panther mounted an 88mm gun in a heavily armored turretless hull. It was an effective weapon that could destroy Fireflies at ranges where the Firefly couldn't effectively respond. But Jagd Panthers were produced in small numbers and arrived too late to change the strategic situation. Germany was losing the tank war not because their designs were inferior, but because they couldn't produce enough of them and couldn't train enough qualified crews to operate them effectively. The Firefly was symptomatic of a larger reality that German commanders were slow to accept. British and American industrial capacity had surpassed German capacity by massive margins. The Allies could afford to convert thousands of tanks to new configurations. They could produce millions of rounds of specialized ammunition. They could train crews extensively because they had adequate fuel for training. They could replace losses because their production exceeded their consumption. Germany could not match any of these capabilities. German industry was strained beyond its limits. Raw materials were scarce. Fuel was rationed even for training. Every tank lost was difficult to replace. Every experienced crew killed represented training time that couldn't be recovered. The weight of numbers was overwhelming German qualitative advantages. The combat performance data from Firefly units validated the design decisions and the tactical doctrine. British tank units equipped with Fireflies achieved significantly better kill-to-loss ratios against German armor than units without Fireflies. Statistical analysis conducted after the war showed that Fireflies accounted for approximately 70% of German heavy tank kills by British forces, despite comprising only 15 to 20% of British tanks. This disproportionate effectiveness demonstrated that the 17-pounder gun had successfully addressed the critical capability gap that British tanks had faced earlier in the war. The Firefly gave British tank crews the confidence that they could engage any German tank and have a reasonable expectation of winning. That psychological advantage was as important as the technical advantage. The testimonies of British tank crews who fought in Fireflies reveal the weapon's impact on morale and battlefield effectiveness. Trooper Joe Ekins served as a gunner in a Firefly with the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry. In post-war interviews, Ekins described how the 17-pounder gun transformed British tank tactics. Before the Firefly, British tanks had to use mobility and flanking maneuvers to defeat German heavy tanks. These tactics required skill and courage, but also involved significant risk. Many British tanks were destroyed during flanking movements. With the Firefly, they could engage frontally at long range. This simplified tactics and reduced casualties. The engagement became more direct and decisive. Ekins himself is credited with destroying 3 Tiger tanks in a single engagement near Saint-Aignan-de-Crèmesnil on August 8, 1944. One of those Tigers was almost certainly Michael Wittmann's command tank. Ekins described the engagement as methodical rather than heroic. His commander identified the targets. Ekins laid the gun and fired. The 17-pounder did what it was designed to do. It penetrated Tiger armor at ranges where the Tigers couldn't effectively respond. The German tanks were destroyed one after another. Ekins said there was no sense of triumph during the engagement. It was simply a job that had to be done. The 17-pounder gun made it possible to do that job effectively. Other Firefly crews reported similar experiences. The gun gave them capabilities they had never had before. They could engage German tanks that had previously been untouchable. They could fight on equal terms with the best German equipment. The confidence this generated transformed British tank operations. Tank commanders who had been cautious and defensive became aggressive and offensive. They sought engagements with German heavy tanks because they knew they could win. This change in attitude was as important as the technical capability of the gun itself. The German commanders who survived the war and wrote about their experiences consistently identified the Sherman Firefly as one of the weapons that changed the tactical balance in Normandy and throughout the subsequent campaign in northwest Europe. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded German panzer forces in Normandy, wrote in his memoir that the Firefly was a nasty surprise that significantly complicated German armored operations. He noted that German tank commanders could no longer assume they could engage Allied tanks at range with impunity. The presence of Fireflies meant that every engagement carried risk, even for the heaviest German tanks. German tanks had to be more cautious. They had to use terrain more carefully. They had to avoid exposing themselves at long range unnecessarily. All of these tactical adjustments reduced German offensive capability and made defensive operations more difficult. General Heinz Guderian, who is responsible for German armored development and doctrine, wrote after the war that the Firefly represented a significant threat that German intelligence had failed to anticipate adequately. He noted that the combination of a proven tank chassis with a powerful anti-tank gun created a weapon that was more effective than its individual components suggested. He observed that British engineering had solved problems that German engineers had assumed were insoluble. Installing such a large gun in a medium tank turret had seemed impossible. The British had made it work through careful engineering and determination. Guderian concluded that German intelligence had underestimated British technical capabilities. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces in Normandy until he was wounded in July 1944, mentioned the Firefly in his final reports to Hitler. Rommel noted that British tank units had significantly improved their anti-tank capabilities since the North African campaign. He specifically mentioned the long-barreled Sherman as a weapon that could engage German heavy tanks effectively. Rommel recommended that German tank crews be trained to recognize and prioritize Firefly targets. He also recommended that German industry develop countermeasures, but Rommel's influence was waning by mid-1944. His recommendations were noted but not implemented systematically. The Firefly didn't single-handedly win the tank war in Northwest Europe. Other factors were equally important: superior Allied numbers, better logistics, more reliable mechanical systems, better trained crews, adequate fuel supplies, air superiority that prevented German tanks from maneuvering freely. The Firefly was one component of British tank effectiveness, but it was a crucial component. It was the weapon that gave British tank crews the ability to engage German heavy tanks on equal terms. This capability transformed British tank operations from defensive and reactive to offensive and aggressive. The psychological impact of the Firefly extended beyond its direct combat effects. German tank crews who had dominated armored combat for years suddenly felt vulnerable. They could no longer assume that their heavy armor and powerful guns guaranteed victory. Every engagement with British tanks now carried the risk of encountering a Firefly. German crews became more cautious. They used more defensive tactics. They were less willing to press attacks when they encountered resistance. This change in German behavior gave British forces tactical advantages that went far beyond the specific capabilities of the 17-pounder gun. The combat statistics from Firefly units are impressive. In the period from D-Day to the end of the war, Sherman Fireflies accounted for the destruction of more German heavy tanks than all other British anti-tank weapons combined. This includes towed anti-tank guns, tank destroyers, and aircraft. The Firefly was the single most effective British weapon against German armor. Individual Firefly crews achieved remarkable records. Some gunners were credited with destroying more than 20 German tanks. Some Firefly tanks survived dozens of engagements and continued fighting until the end of the war. The durability of the Sherman chassis, combined with the effectiveness of the 17-pounder gun, created a weapon system that performed far better than its individual components suggested. The logistical achievement required to support Firefly operations was also remarkable. The 17-pounder ammunition was much larger and heavier than standard Sherman ammunition. Supply chains had to be modified to handle the different requirements. Ammunition ships crossing the Atlantic carried millions of 17-pounder shells. Depots in Britain and on the continent stockpiled the specialized ammunition. Ammunition trucks delivered shells to forward units regardless of tactical conditions. The supply system never failed. Firefly crews never ran short of ammunition when they needed it. This logistical reliability was crucial to the weapon's effectiveness. Training programs for Firefly crews were expanded and refined throughout the war. Gunnery schools developed specialized courses for 17-pounder operators. The training emphasized accuracy and speed. Gunners learned to identify German tank types at long range. They memorized the vulnerable areas on each type. They practiced engaging multiple targets in sequence. They learned to operate under stress and in poor visibility. The training was demanding, but it produced gunners who could use the Firefly's capabilities to their full potential. By late 1944, British Firefly gunners were among the most skilled tank gunners in any army. The impact of improved training was visible in combat results. Early Firefly engagements in June and July 1944 had mixed results. Some crews performed excellently, while others struggled with the unfamiliar weapon. By August and September, performance had improved dramatically as crews gained experience and training programs were refined. Hit rates increased, engagement times decreased, tactical employment became more sophisticated. The learning curve was steep, but British crews climbed it rapidly. German crews, by contrast, were getting less training and less experience as German resources became scarce. The qualitative gap between British and German tank crews narrowed throughout the war until British crews were arguably superior in many situations. The Firefly also played an important role in British tank development after the war. The lessons learned from mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman influenced the design of subsequent British tanks. The Centurion tank, which entered service just as the war ended, was designed from the beginning to mount the 17-pounder gun. Later versions mounted even more powerful guns. The A-41 Centurion became one of the most successful tank designs in history, serving with numerous armies for decades. The engineering solutions developed for the Firefly provided the foundation for these post-war developments. The Sherman Firefly continued to serve throughout the remainder of the war in Europe. It participated in the breakout from Normandy. It fought in the advance across France. It crossed the Rhine with British armored units. It was present at the final surrender of German forces in May 1945. By the time Germany